Thank you, everyone, for the committee for inviting me, and for all of you for attending this session today. I'm hoping that I can provide you with some information that may be new and may also be helpful to your care as a patient, but also some information that maybe you can share with your providers as well to assist with care. And I'll also be answering any questions thereafter. To give you a little bit of background about what I do before I start, I work in kidney transplantation at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania at the Penn Transplant Institute. We are the largest kidney transplant institute in our region. We do transplant patients with glomerulonephritis, vasculitis, Wegener's disease. So some patients are similar populations to what some of you may be experiencing as well. In my practice, I see patients before transplant, when they're being evaluated for transplant, at the time of transplant in the hospital, as well as after transplant. So we follow patients through all phases of care, and I get many questions from patients about supplements and medical marijuana, especially more recently about medical marijuana. So I'm going to hopefully share some of the information today based on questions that I have gotten from patients and what seem to be kind of the burning questions in the community. So with that, I'll start. In terms of conflicts of interest, I don't have any related to this lecture. However, I will be providing educational information about medical marijuana and cannabis. However, as a pharmacist and per my institution, I am not able to provide any specific recommendations regarding its use for a specific patient. That would need to be discussed on a case-by-case basis with your provider. Today we'll discuss what are some of the patterns of dietary supplements in the United States in terms of use patterns. We'll also discuss some perceptions and misconceptions of dietary supplement use, and these will reflect what I hear from patients and providers. And also we'll talk about some steps for providers, caregivers, and patients to have an open discussion about dietary supplement use and medical marijuana or cannabis. Many times I hear from patients, I would love to talk to my provider about supplements that I'm taking, but I don't know how to. And so hopefully I'll give you some of that information today. Dietary supplements are defined by regulations, by a federal regulation, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. And basically it's defined as a product other than tobacco that's intended to supplement the diet, and it can contain any of the following agents that I have listed here: vitamins, minerals, herbs or botanicals, amino acids, dietary substance used to increase dietary intake, or a concentration or combination of any of these. They are all meant for oral ingestion when we're talking about these dietary supplements. What I often hear from patients are, when I meet with them before transplant or after transplant is, when I ask, are you taking any supplements? Often I hear, well, why would you be concerned about that? Or why would you want to know that information? They're natural, they're safe. There's nothing to discuss more than that. For reasons for taking them, a lot of times I also hear that they balance my body against the medication effects. Some patients will tell me the prescription medications they're taking, they refer to them as poisons, and they say these natural supplements counteract the poisons that you're giving me. I also hear that they're not actually medications, so you shouldn't care if I use them. You shouldn't be asking me about this. Providers, a lot of patients feel providers have a bias against supplements. I hear often that they'd rather me use those expensive prescription medications than supplements. And finally, I often hear that I feel better knowing I'm taking something natural more than versus more medications. These are all valid concerns, and I'm not saying don't ever use supplements, but I think there's a right way to be able to use supplements to integrate into care, and a not so great way to do so. And so hopefully, again, we'll go through some of the points to consider if you're thinking about using supplements, and have an open discussion with your provider to see if that's an appropriate choice for you. They're not always appropriate in all scenarios. In terms of people saying that it's something natural, being a pharmacist, for me, all medications, including prescription medications, have started out as natural at some point in their life, right? So, for example, one of the medications that we use in transplant, which sometimes could be used in vasculitis as well, I guess, it would be tacrolimus or Prograf. And tacrolimus was found on a mountain in Japan as a fungus. That's what it started its life as, and now we take it as a capsule. So I think all supplements, to me, I consider them the same as medications, and just likewise, medications have also, in their early life, started out as something natural as well. So there's a lot of crossover between these agents. So I have a question here, just to make sure everyone's still awake. What % of adults in the United States in 2018 do you think reported using a dietary supplement? And I believe you all have cards that you can use. So A is 25%, B is 50%, C is 75%, and D is 100%. And hold them up high. Okay, good. We've got a lot of good responses. Okay. All right, good. So the correct answer, which I think the majority of you have, is C. 75% of Americans took a dietary supplement in 2018. And these results were based on the Council for Responsible Nutrition Consumer Survey. But if you look at other surveys, the results are similar in that the use of herbal supplements, dietary supplements, has increased, particularly over the last decade. In this particular report, 98% reported taking vitamins or minerals, and almost half reported using an herbal or botanical supplement. In terms of who uses supplements, there's 2 surveys that looked at this in the United States, and both have shown that women use them more often than men. People who are college educated tend to use those more than those that are high school educated or less. Older people use them more than younger people. Typically, as the age increases, we see more supplement use in older populations. Patients with chronic illnesses more than acute illnesses has also been found. And in a survey in 2015, they specifically found patients with, who had stroke, obesity, arthritis, breathing problems, which sort of links some of this into the chronic illnesses, were more likely to use these supplements. People who felt comfortable with use of over-the-counter medications also use them more often. And they also have, in the 2015 survey, use of a mail-order pharmacy was associated with greater supplement use. In my opinion, I think that's because people who are using a mail-order pharmacy are often doing so for chronic medical conditions and needing more than one prescription medication often. So this ties in with using patients with chronic illness more than acute illness. So I have another question for you. This is a true or false question. You can use card A for true and B for false. The Food and Drug Administration reviews all dietary supplements to make sure they are safe before manufacturers market them to the public. Very good. Exactly. This is false. And so this is where your providers often have a lot of concern regarding what exactly is in that supplement. So the differences between FDA-approved medications and supplements, herbal supplements, is summarized here. They don't require any pre-market notification, and there's no requirement for proof of efficacy or safety before they are basically marketed to the public. In terms of efficacy, it's interesting. I have here at the bottom under disease treatment claims. For these dietary supplements, if you look closely on the bottle, it always has a label in very small print that says, this has not been evaluated by the FDA and is not intended to diagnose, cure, prevent, or treat any disease. So a lot of times you see on these bottles, a good example is melatonin, for example, and it says in very large print, usually on the front of the bottle, right under the term melatonin, promotes sleep. And then if you look, it usually has a little number 1 or an asterisk above that statement. And if you refer to the asterisk, it directs you to the fact that it says this has not been evaluated. So it's really confusing to consumers because you're picking up a bottle that you think is going to be working for something when really you don't know if it does or not. because it hasn't been evaluated in that capacity. And that's where things can get a little tricky. In terms of safety, there is no proof of safety before marketing. However, when the FDA receives reports about issues with a supplement, they then can investigate that further. And so if a manufacturer, if it's reported to a manufacturer that there was a really significant problem with a supplement that resulted in what we call a serious adverse event, such as a hospitalization or worse, patient death, if a manufacturer receives that information, within 15 days they have to report that to the FDA. Supplements are required to follow good manufacturing practice, as are FDA-approved medications, but not all of them always do. So one of the things you want to look for on a bottle when you're assessing if you are considering taking a supplement is if it says follows good manufacturing practice. That's really important versus somebody manufacturing this in their backyard. And again, the disease treatment claims, you have to be very careful with that. A lot of times I tell patients to not even pay attention to that portion, but to have a discussion with your provider instead if it's an appropriate choice. The other thing we're concerned about are adverse events or adverse effects. And yes, these can certainly also happen with prescription medications too. But more recently, there's been some data to give us more information on this, and one was 63 emergency departments in the United States, and they estimated that 23,000 emergency department visits per year were attributed to adverse events from supplements, including ingestion in unsupervised children. They also estimated that herbal supplement or dietary supplement use was related to over 2,000 hospitalizations per year. Now, when you put this in comparison to what we see with prescription medications, it's actually much less. It's only about 5% of what we see with prescription medications. However, this does tell us that there's a significant concern or issue here that we have to be concerned about, in that these products are not necessarily 100% without risk. And so that's where, again, it's important to take those considerations and factor them into when you're going to be using a supplement and if it's appropriate or not. The other concern is what is actually in the product. So there's a database through the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research that looked at the tainted products that were marketed as dietary supplements over a good period of time, more recently, 2007 to 16. And they found almost 800 adulterated dietary supplements and 146 different companies making them. To me, that was a staggering number when you're walking through your supermarket or your pharmacy, what's available to the consumer. And almost a quarter of them had greater than one unapproved ingredient. And you'll see this in the news from time to time too. For example, there have been reports of supplements that are being marketed, for example, for sexual enhancement. And people are saying, wow, these really work, these work so well. And then we find in a report that it's because they have the drug, for example, Viagra, in them. But that is not on the label at all. Sometimes we see things that say this product is going to cause weight loss, and people say it really seems to be working for me. And when we look more closely, it's because they've added a prescription medication associated with weight loss into the supplement. And again, this isn't disclosed on the label. So that's where, again, we want to go back to the good manufacturing practice is one component that we want to look at when we're considering supplements. We also have to be concerned about drug-drug interactions. Supplements and medications can have additive effects that work against each other. For example, red yeast rice used to contain a statin, lovastatin. So if you're already on a medication, such as example would be pravastatin, a statin, basically you're taking two statins at the same time, and that can increase your risk for side effects. Another one that I see commonly in my practice working with immunosuppressed patients is people always are trying to boost their immune system to make it better. So they may be taking echinacea, or another common one I get a lot of is emergency, and taking it in substantial amounts. That could potentially work against the medications that we're using to try to decrease inflammation and decrease prevent rejection or the use of an immunosuppressant agent. So essentially they could work against each other. And that's why it's important, particularly for me as a provider, to know exactly what a patient is taking, the entire profile of what they're taking, medication prescription-wise, over-the-counter medication-wise, as well as supplement-wise. Supplements can also affect how some of the prescription medications are absorbed, distributed, or broken down and eliminated from the body as well. And again, so these are things where we have to look at these at each visit and make sure that there's not a major interaction here. And they may change how fast prescription medications are broken down and eliminated, either making them slower or faster. Sometimes that can put people at increased risk of side effects, or it could cause your prescription medication to not work as well, which obviously both of those are of great concern. So how do you know that you've decided and you've talked with your provider and said this supplement's okay to take? How do you know which supplement you should be looking for to make sure it doesn't contain unadulterated product and that it was that the manufacturer followed good manufacturing practice? You want to look for an independent verification process, and I've listed a few here. The one that is pretty common, that can be commonly found, that I see most commonly in, for example, supermarkets or pharmacies, are supplements that are USP verified. And it basically has these 4 points with independent verification. It should contain the ingredients listed on the label in that amount. There shouldn't be anything else added to it. They've tested to make sure it doesn't have any other prescription medications or other things in it, such as heavy metals. It's also been tested to make sure that it breaks down in the body in the way that it should, that we think it will, and that it was made, again, according to good manufacturing practice. Some other independent verification reviews I've listed here also: NSF International, ConsumerLab.com. I will tell you with their website that you do need to have a membership for that. A lot of their information is hard to access unless you sign up to become a member for it, but there is some general information that you can access without that. Another one is UL, and I've listed the websites. So my last question here is, have you ever had a discussion with your provider about dietary supplements you may currently be using or think about using? A is yes, and B is no. Okay, so a few. Okay, good. So how do we have what I call having the supplement talk? So there was a study that was done of 35 primary care providers as well as over 100 patients. This is conducted in California, and they asked patients and providers separately in a survey, what do you think is important to know about supplements? And here in the bolded column here, I'm not going to read each individually, but these were the topics that both providers and patients thought were important to discuss. Interestingly, most in the survey, including the providers, said that they did not routinely discuss supplements with their patients at visits. And I've listed some of the patient comments here and provider comments here. One of the patient comments I really liked was the third one, that it would be nice to be confirmed by a medical professional that the information I'm getting, hearsay from friends, not necessarily factual, is indeed true. And that's often what prompts a lot of these discussions. From the provider side, one of them had noted, I feel almost responsible to let them know supplements are not FDA regulated. So again, there's concerns and different concerns on both sides of this, but nevertheless, all of them are important to discuss. In terms of discussion points for having the talk, this is typically sort of the outline that I use when I'm going through this with patients. I give them a copy of it and I use a copy. And we start with questions like, why are you taking it? Who recommended you to take it, or was it self-initiated? When did you start taking it? How much and how often are you taking? A lot of times people are confused by the supplement size. On the supplement, it has a serving, and they may not realize, for example, that when we're talking about that it's supposed to be 2 tablets and they've just been taking 1 tablet. So that's really important information to look at on the label to determine how much they're taking. I also like to know, how has it benefited you? Do you think it has done something? Sometimes the response I get from patients is, no, I don't think it's done a darn thing, but my friend takes it, my wife takes it, so I just take it. And there's no need to necessarily take something if it's not benefiting you. I feel the same way. I use the same philosophy for over-the-counter medications, prescription medications. If we're not getting the effect we want from it, why am I giving it to you? So it's important to look at all of these together. Also, I'd like to review, do you feel it has harmed you? Sometimes people are describing side effects to me that may be, for example, as a result of the additive effects of the supplement and another prescription medication that we're giving them. And so we have to reassess that. And for example, if we say we're going to continue using the supplement, maybe we reduce the dose of the prescription medication, or vice versa. Maybe we reduce the dose of the supplement. In terms of looking, if a provider says, yes, it's okay to take this supplement, it's important to look for all interactions and assess for supplement safety and to report any adverse events to the FDA. Patients or providers can report that. I often like to contact the manufacturer for further information too. I get some interesting responses when I do. I had one manufacturer, a patient wanted to take a blue algae supplement, and I called them and I said, hey, I have a kidney transplant patient that wants to use your supplement. Can you, any information, anything you can tell me about manufacturing process, or, you know, where is your product coming from? And the person said to me, well, you know, there's a lot of people in national sports organizations that take this supplement and they don't ask those questions. And if it's good enough for them, why is it not good enough for your patient? Not the answer I was looking for. And it's good, though, to be able to tell that information to the patient, though, right? I mean, versus the provider just flat out saying, no, you can't take it. I wouldn't be satisfied with that answer. I want to know why I can't take it. So it's important to look into these things. I've also had other manufacturers give me very good responses, and more than a few that have told me we outright would not recommend our supplement in a kidney transplant recipient because of such and such a reason, or because there's an ingredient in it that we think might be nephrotoxic or cause kidney toxicity. And whoa, that's not what we want to use either. So it's either the patient or the provider can contact the manufacturer, and it's always good to see what information you get back from them. Providers also have access to databases such as Micromedics and Lexicomp, where they can review information about drug-drug interactions and an overview of these supplements. And again, if the supplement is approved, I cannot stress enough to use a product that was independently certified. Sometimes you'll see on these sites that it'll say product certified, and if you call them and say, who certified it? If it's the same company that manufactured the supplement, that is not independent verification. And I would not recommend that supplement unless they were otherwise independently certified beyond that, okay? And again, it's important that providers and patients address supplement use and questions at every visit, and contact your provider in between visits when you have questions. I've listed some patient resources on dietary supplements at all. The last one is a particularly good site that I really like for Medline Plus herbs and supplements. There's a lot of great information there. I just briefly will go through a couple points about medical marijuana and cannabis. Currently, 33 states are approved for comprehensive medical marijuana cannabis programs. It's important to realize that it comes in a lot of different various forms, okay? And depending on the formulation, the pharmacokinetics, or how it works in your body and how it interacts with other medications, can differ. So it's really important for your provider and you to know what type you're taking, and if you're approved to be taking a type of that, to make sure that the formulation you're using is consistent, and that, for example, you're not switching between multiple formulations without the provider knowing, because that can affect a lot of different things. Medical marijuana or cannabis is only approved for certain medical conditions, and this varies greatly state by state. And I have a link here that you can look to see, depending on your state, what it's approved for. The other big thing that we run into in Pennsylvania and in my practice is what happens in the inpatient setting. This is a critical point to discuss with your provider, okay? Because each institution has varying policies on what they can or will and will not do with use of medical marijuana in the inpatient setting. And I think that it's often a shock to patients if you get admitted to the hospital and you're told, no, you can't use this, or there's a problem with you using it. you know, it's a time of great anxiety. You're ill. You're in the hospital. It's really important to hammer out those points and have basically a care plan made with your provider and the institution that you would be likely to go to in the event of an emergency, or if you need hospital care. What will happen when I'm an inpatient? How will this be managed? Okay. And again, this is an evolving area for sure. I always encourage patients to have open discussion regarding medical marijuana and cannabis with your provider. I also find a lot of patients, at least that I see before transplant, often will tell me, I'm using medical marijuana. And I say, okay, what are you using it for? And they tell me, and I say, do you have a medical marijuana card? And they say, no, I buy it from my neighbor. That is not medical marijuana, okay? So when we're talking about medical marijuana and cannabis, we want to make sure that you have a medical marijuana card. Anything else is considered recreational, regardless of what you or the source that you're purchasing it from calls it, okay? One of the reasons that for medical marijuana that we want it to come from a licensed distributor is because this also limits exposure to contaminants and adulterated products, which again can cause the same issues that supplements can that we've discussed. And if you're prescribed it, you should, just like a prescription medication, be adhering to the prescribed schedule. If you have issues with side effects with that, those should be discussed with a provider who is prescribing this, as well as with the dispensary sources. In terms of providers, it's important again to review the specific formulation, what the patient's using and how much at each visit, and to continue to screen for drug-drug interactions. Also, it's important to perform lab monitoring, especially for some of these drugs. There's a lot of interactions that can occur with medical marijuana products and prescription drugs and dietary supplements. Medical marijuana, basically, it decreases the breakdown of drugs that go through a certain pathway in the liver called CYP3A4, and over 25% of prescription drugs use that pathway to be broken down. So again, it would be important to know what the patient's using so that the prescription drugs could be adjusted appropriately, and so that hopefully we can maximize the efficacy of everything that the patient's using while minimizing side effects. And again, I think that as this is an evolving field, both providers and patients are going to need ongoing education. Practices are changing every day. And also we need more further research, which we're going to hear a little bit about in the next talk, to help guide future practice. So hopefully I've given you some information looking at the learning objectives again that we covered here that maybe you did not know before. We talked about patterns of supplement use, understanding perceptions and misconceptions, and steps for having to talk with your provider to have a discussion about supplements and cannabis. The take-home points I would give you are to make sure to educate yourself about dietary supplements and potential risk. Natural doesn't always equal safe. I would also urge you to keep up to date with your state changes regarding medical marijuana cannabis policies, and to continue to have an open dialogue with your providers regarding supplements as well as medical marijuana. If a provider deems that a supplement is appropriate for a patient to use, always choose one that, whenever possible, that's an independently verified brand. And always report any dietary supplement adverse events to the Food and Drug Administration. That will help you, providers, and also help other patients who may also already be using that supplement or be thinking about using it. So I thank you for listening, and I'll take a few questions. Okay, so the first question is there a certain brand, Nature Made, etc., that you recommend or trust in terms of dietary supplements? So I do not have stock in any brands, nor can I advocate for one brand over another, but I can tell you that, for example, the company Nature Made does have a lot of USP verified supplements. Not all of them are, but most, they have a good amount that are. That's what I see most often in my practice. And so, again, depending on the type of supplement you're looking for, you may find one that is USP verified or independently verified. with that company. But there are certainly others as well. Let's see. We also had a question about turmeric and using turmeric in terms of its anti-inflammatory responses and free radicals. I believe the previous speaker had also touched on that. So I can't give you any specific information other than that if your provider deems it an appropriate choice, again, I would recommend an independently verified formulation. In the kidney transplant population, we do not tend to use it very often, mainly just because we're worried about kidney effects with it, although some of those are unfound. The problem with a lot of these supplements is there's not a lot of good literature, medical literature, research to guide us, but as that evolves, opinions change. So a lot of supplements, for example, that in the past maybe people said, oh, you know, why are you doing that? Now we see are being used a lot more based on the evidence. And that leads to the next question was regarding fish oil. Fish oil, there is a lot more literature showing that that can be useful. And then there's other literature, for example, in the kidney transplant population that shows it may not be as useful after transplant, but may be more useful, for example, before transplant. So I think it's important for you and your provider to review the information, for example, that's on the National Institute Health website that I showed you the link for example, and have your provider do a literature search to determine if that supplement is appropriate for you at that time, depending on the condition. And I think we'll stop there since I'm out of time.
Later, so that question comes from the department. So hopefully, if there are questions, that I know are many, just come to that. Hopefully, we'll have those.
Okay. Thank you.